In 1996, New York City was shaken by a crime so savage, so sudden, it left a mark on the city's memory for decades. The victim, 40-year-old Howard Pilmer, a prosperous businessman, devoted husband, and loving father. His murder would remain a haunting mystery for 23 long years. Only the relentless advance of forensic science and the unwavering commitment of investigators would eventually bring clarity to a case that had grown cold. Friday, March 22, 1996. The day dawned with sunshine and the promise of spring. The streets of Manhattan bustled as office workers and shopkeepers hurried into another routine day. But for the staff of a well-known office supply store, that routine shattered in a single gruesome moment. As they arrived at the building where they worked, they climbed to the manager's office on the 4th floor, only to be met with a sight of horror. There, lying face down in a thick pool of blood, was their boss, Howard Pilmer. His body was motionless. The room was still. Panic set in. Without hesitation, they called the police. Officers responded swiftly. The crime scene was chilling. Pilmer had been stabbed over and over. Slashes and punctures ripped through his neck, chest, and back. It was overkill, ferocious, but the scene revealed something even more disturbing. There was no sign of a break-in. Nothing was stolen. Everything appeared untouched. The violence had not been random. This was personal. Howard Pilmer had recently turned 40. He had a wife and a young son. He'd taken over operations of his father Frank's business, an office supply empire with a loyal customer base. But Howard wasn't just a man content to run someone else's legacy. He was a visionary. Long before it became a national obsession, Howard saw the future in coffee. He believed that America would one day line up for premium cups of it, and he acted on that vision. He opened a sleek, upscale cafe inside his office supply store and named it Philip after his son. Customers loved it. They came for the coffee and stayed for the experience. One cafe became two. Business boomed. Rosalind Pilmer, Howard's wife, had once worked as a dental assistant. But as her husband's ambitions grew, she left dentistry behind to support his ventures. She helped manage the cafes and played an increasingly active role in the business. Together, they looked like a power couple on the rise. When the news of Howard's death broke, Rosalind wasted no time. She arrived at the office that morning with a calm and composed demeanor. She reassured the distraught employees, told them the business would go on, and tried to project strength. It was a striking response, measured, unwavering. Howard and Rosalind had met back in high school. Their love story was classic, two young hearts finding each other early. In 1982, they celebrated a lavish wedding, surrounded by friends and family. They eventually settled in one of Manhattan's most prestigious neighborhoods, the Upper East Side. 4 years later, in 1986, their son Philip was born. From the outside, the Pilmer family appeared to have it all: success, wealth, and a tight-knit bond. But when Howard was brutally murdered in the very office where he built his dream, the image began to crack. The investigation launched immediately. Detectives combed through the possibilities. Who had a motive? Who had access? Who was the last person to see him alive? The clues were sparse, but suspicion simmered just beneath the surface. The day after the murder, March 23rd, detectives visited the Pilmer apartment. Rosalind answered the door and let them in. Her tone was steady, her face unreadable. She told police that she and Howard had been happily married. No fights, no drama. Everything, she claimed, had been fine. She went on to explain that on the evening of March 21st, the night before Howard was killed, she and her brother, Evan Wald, had visited Howard's office. The three of them discussed business matters. When the conversation ended, she and Evan left. Howard stayed behind. He told them he planned to finish some work and then catch a basketball game on TV. Rosalind claimed she grew concerned when Howard didn't come home that night. She tried calling his office. He didn't answer, so she left a message on the answering machine, a casual, affectionate check-in. "Hello, it's 8:10 p.m. now. Philip and I wanted to know if you're still working or if you went to a sports bar. I'm sure you'll call me from there. We'll talk later. See you then. Love you." But Howard never called back. The following morning, everything changed. Rosalind Pilmer began to panic. With no word from her husband and no sign of him at home, she picked up the phone and began calling local hospitals. Somewhere deep inside, she feared the worst, but held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Howard had suffered an accident and was receiving treatment in a medical facility. But there was no record of him anywhere. Meanwhile, detectives pressed forward. They questioned Howard's family members, his employees, anyone who might know something, anyone who might have a reason to want him gone. Rumors began to surface. Whispers circulated that Howard had not been faithful to his wife. Some claimed he had affairs, several of them. Could a jealous lover or a vengeful spouse have sought retribution? Or perhaps someone inside the business? A disgruntled employee pushed too far? There was no sign of forced entry into Howard's office. No broken locks. No shattered windows. Nothing was missing. Whoever had done this hadn't come to steal. They came to kill. And they had come in with access. With familiarity. With rage. 48 stab wounds. That was the final count. Some of those wounds were post-mortem, inflicted after Howard had already taken his last breath. The act was not only violent, it was personal. It was an execution drenched in fury. Then came a discovery that deepened the intrigue. When investigators interviewed Rosalind's brother, Evan Wald, they noticed fresh lacerations on his left hand. Evan claimed the injuries were nothing more than a workplace accident. He said he'd broken a plate while working at the cafe and cut himself in the process. But suspicions only grew. Evan and Howard had a volatile relationship. They clashed often. Witnesses described heated arguments and constant friction between the two men. And in the days leading up to the murder, Evan was observed doing something unusual, asking a security guard questions about the surveillance cameras outside the office building. Why would he care about the cameras? After Howard's death, everything changed. His entire estate, his businesses, his real estate, and all of his assets were inherited by Rosalind. And in addition to her windfall from the estate, she received over $1 million from a life insurance policy. Just 10 days after the murder, Rosalind made a shocking move. She announced the sale of Howard's business. While most widows might still be in mourning, Rosalind was already in negotiations, calculating, decisive, determined to get the highest offer. Detectives began to take a harder look at her past. The confident, composed woman who appeared so in control had secrets buried deep in her history. Rosalind had spent 16 years working as an assistant and bookkeeper for a respected New York dentist named Dr. Stanley Weinstock. What investigators uncovered was staggering. Over the course of several years, Rosalind had embezzled large sums of money from the dental office. Patient checks, 186 of them, had been funneled into her personal bank account. She had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars without anyone noticing. But eventually, the truth came to light. In 1995, after Rosalind left the dental practice to work full-time on her husband's cafe business, Dr. Weinstock's new bookkeeper began to piece together the fraud. The discovery led to a meeting between Rosalind and the accountant. Confronted with the evidence, Rosalind broke down. She confessed, sobbing. She begged the bookkeeper not to tell Howard. She feared that if he ever found out, he would cast her out of the house, and she would lose access to the one person she loved most in the world, her son, Philip. Rosalind made a promise. She would repay every dollar. But as time passed, the money never came. And as 1996 began, her financial situation worsened. Tax season arrived, and Rosalind found herself owing nearly $15,000 to the state of New York for the coffee business. She didn't have the funds. She didn't tell anyone, and her panic was growing. Howard's stepsister, Heather, noticed that Rosalind wasn't herself in the days leading up to the murder. She was thinner, nervous, preoccupied. Heather asked her gently, "Are you okay?" Rosalind forced a smile and replied, "Yes, I'm fine." But her brother Evan painted a different picture. When Heather later questioned Evan about Rosalind's strange behavior, he delivered a chilling response. "If Howard ever hurts her, I'll kill him." The very next day, Howard was dead. The murder weapon, a knife, was never found. No fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance footage. But to the Pilmer family, the truth was clear. Rosalind and Evan were responsible. Frank Pilmer, Howard's grieving father, was so convinced of their guilt that he forbade them from seeing his grandson. He was cut off from Philip. Still, Frank refused to give up. He became a regular at the police station, pleading for updates, desperate for justice, and determined to see the people he believed had destroyed his family brought to account. The investigation pressed on, driven in part by a grieving father who refused to stay silent. Frank Pilmer became a fixture at the police station, calling daily, showing up in person, urging detectives to dig deeper, to push harder. His voice became the conscience of the case, a relentless reminder that justice had not yet been served. Rosalind, in stark contrast, showed little concern. She never called the authorities, never asked about the progress, never pushed for answers. The silence was deafening. As the first anniversary of Howard's murder approached, the NYPD launched a renewed public appeal. Posters bearing Howard Pilmer's face and details of the unsolved homicide were plastered across the city, pleading with anyone who knew something to come forward. But something strange began happening. The posters kept disappearing, torn down almost as soon as they were put up. Street surveillance provided an answer. Cameras caught Evan Wald and his sister Janet, Rosalind's biological sister, removing the posters. When questioned, their explanation was bizarre but revealing. The sight of the posters, they claimed, filled them with dread. They said the attention was unbearable, that the police were persecuting them, that they just wanted to live in peace. But for the detectives, peace would come only with truth. Then came a breakthrough of a different kind. In 1997, Rosalind Pilmer was arrested not for murder, but for the financial crimes committed years earlier at the dental office. She pled guilty to embezzlement. Her punishment, a suspended sentence, thanks to the full repayment of what she had stolen. The money, of course, came from the sale of her murdered husband's business and the life insurance payout she had received after his death. By 1999, advancements in DNA technology opened new possibilities. Rosalind and Evan were asked to provide blood samples, and in the quiet, sterile environment of the crime lab, investigators found something damning. A small drop of Evan's blood, discovered on the wall of Howard's office on the day of the murder. It was physical evidence, tangible, unshakable, but the prosecution hesitated. At that time, they ruled it inconclusive. One drop wasn't enough, and so the case went cold. For 2 decades, during those 20 years, life continued as if nothing had happened. Rosalind found a job in another dental clinic. She worked, paid her taxes, raised her son. Philip Pilmer graduated from a prestigious private school, attended college, and eventually enrolled in law school. He went on to marry and land a position at a major law firm. From the outside, he seemed untouched by the tragedy that had shaped his childhood. Evan Wald, too, moved on. He got married and stayed in the food industry. He lived quietly, away from the shadows of the past. But justice has a memory, and investigators never truly let go of the case. On August 15, 2017, over 2 decades after the brutal slaying of Howard Pilmer, Rosalind Pilmer and Evan Wald were arrested and charged with his murder. Their denials were immediate and emphatic. They claimed innocence. They insisted they had nothing to do with Howard's death. But bail was denied. The court deemed them a flight risk. Their defense attorneys argued that the case against them was built on circumstantial evidence, that the only physical connection to the crime was a single drop of blood belonging to Evan. And even that, they argued, could have been left there at any time. Evan maintained that he had cut himself days earlier in the cafe and had merely gone to Howard's office to talk about work. The prosecution told a different story. They claimed Rosalind had a clear and powerful motive: financial desperation. She was drowning in debt, owed money to her former employer, to the tax authorities. The motive was survival and greed. Rosalind attempted to explain the theft from the dental office. She said she had only done it to help her mother pay off a mortgage. Yes, she'd stolen, but murder? No, she insisted. She loved her husband. They were happy. She even told her sister that she had confessed her financial troubles to Howard days before he died. According to her, Howard had embraced her, promised they would fix things together. But the prosecutors didn't believe it. To them, it was all part of the cover. A carefully staged performance hiding a violent conspiracy. On January 17, 2019, the courtroom doors opened on a trial that had been more than 2 decades in the making. The world watched as Rosalind Pilmer and Evan Wald faced charges for the murder of Howard Pilmer, a crime marked by brutality and betrayal. The state laid out its case. That Rosalind and Evan had planned the murder together. That they executed it with cruel efficiency. That the motive was money. That the aftermath, Rosalind's swift business dealings, Evan's surveillance inquiries, their joint destruction of police posters, spoke volumes. The evidence was mostly circumstantial. But one key piece refused to fade. That drop of blood. Evan's blood. Found in the very room where Howard had been stabbed 48 times. And on Evan's left hand, fresh scars, just days after the killing. The people who murdered his father have finally been held accountable. The prosecution's case was built piece by piece, layer by damning layer. One of the most compelling elements remained the single drop of Evan Wald's blood found at the crime scene. A drop that prosecutors believed was left behind during the frenzy of the murder. That blood was located on the wall of Howard's office, in the very space where the killing had occurred. Evan claimed the injury that caused it happened the day before at work. But that story didn't hold up under scrutiny. A photograph taken a full week after the murder showed fresh cuts on Evan's left hand. The defense tried to explain it away, noting that Evan was left-handed and could have cut himself any number of ways. But then Howard's sister, Heather, delivered testimony that contradicted Evan's account entirely. She had seen him on March 21st, the day before the murder, and had noticed nothing unusual. No wounds, no bandages. Just coffee grounds under his fingernails, as always. That tiny detail, the kind that only someone close would notice, was devastating to the defense. Evan's attorney insisted that a single drop of blood could not prove guilt. After all, the office was soaked with blood, on the floor, on the walls, even in the bathroom, but all of it belonged to Howard. There was no proof, the defense claimed, that Evan had killed anyone. But the prosecution countered with a chilling theory. Evan had washed up in the office bathroom after the attack. And Rosalind, she had waited nearby the entire time. Rosalind's motive remained clear. It was about money, about desperation and mounting pressure. Neil Klein, an accountant who had once worked for Dr. Stanley Weinstock, took the stand and told the court that just weeks before Howard's death, he had contacted Rosalind. He threatened legal action if she didn't pay back the money she had stolen. And then there was the IRS. A letter was introduced as evidence, one with a final warning. If Rosalind didn't make the $15,000 payment by March 21st, her cafe would be shut down. It was no coincidence that March 21st was the night Howard Pilmer was last seen alive. That same night, Rosalind placed a call to Howard's office and left a message. Her voice was calm. She said she had just gotten home. It was precisely 8:10 p.m. But why include the exact time in the message? Prosecutors saw it as suspiciously deliberate, almost like an alibi spoken into evidence. Then came the testimony that shook the courtroom. 2 decades after the crime, Allison Lewis, once a fresh-faced college graduate and nanny to the Pilmer family, had stayed silent for years. In 1996, she had been reluctant to come forward. Rosalind paid her generously, and Allison feared losing her job. But time changed her, and in 2019, she finally stepped forward. Allison recalled the day of the murder vividly. On the afternoon of March 21st, she had taken young Philip to his hockey practice. Rosalind and Evan, she was told, had a business meeting with Howard. That wasn't unusual. But what happened next was, that evening, Rosalind called Allison with a sudden change of plans. "We're not finished yet. We're still at the office," she said. Allison was asked to pick Philip up from practice and take him home. When they arrived at the apartment, Rosalind was already there. Her hair was wet, the lights were off, and she seemed uneasy. She stood at the door and didn't invite Allison in. This strange behavior, the timing, the secrecy, the damp hair, aligned too closely with the prosecution's theory. Rosalind and Evan had been at the office. Howard was murdered. Rosalind washed up, went home, and constructed an alibi. After nearly 2 months of arguments, witnesses, cross-examinations, and mounting tension, the case was handed to the jury. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy. Emotions simmered beneath the surface. There were no cameras, no flashes, just quiet anguish. On one side, Howard's grieving family. On the other, the accused Rosalind and Evan, surrounded by their supporters. Philip sat silently, trying to make sense of the collapse of the world he once knew. The jury deliberated carefully, methodically, and then they delivered their verdict. Rosalind Pilmer, guilty of second-degree murder. Evan Wald, guilty of second-degree murder. The moment the words were spoken, Philip stood up, shaken, stunned, and ran from the courtroom. The verdict was announced in July 2019. Before the sentencing, Howard's father, Frank Pilmer, addressed the court with tears in his eyes and pain etched deep into his face. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling, "I haven't had a full night's sleep since March 22, 1996. Every night, I see my son's face. I think about what was done to him. That night, I lost 3 things. 2 of them, I'll never get back. My son and my business. But I also lost my grandson, Philip, and he still won't look at me. I just want him to know that justice has finally been done. We all love him and want him with us." Frank Pilmer's voice echoed through the courtroom, heavy with sorrow, trembling with the weight of 23 years of grief. He hoped those final words would reach his grandson's heart. That Philip, standing just feet away, would look up, would walk toward him, would offer a handshake, perhaps even a long-awaited embrace. But none of that happened. Philip Pilmer remained still, emotionally resolute, unmoved. When it came time for him to speak, Philip addressed the court, not with anger, but with pain. He looked toward the judge and delivered a message rooted in anguish and conviction. Locking his mother away, he said, would not bring his father back. Justice, to him, was no antidote to loss. Tears welled in Rosalind's eyes as she listened to the words of the son she had raised. She sobbed silently beside her brother, Evan, who too was overcome with emotion. Philip's voice cracked as he thanked his mother, not for what she had done in that courtroom, but for everything she had done before, for raising him, for ensuring he received a good education, for standing by him when he was too young to understand the depths of his father's death, for being the only parent he had known since that dark March day in 1996. He didn't defend her innocence. He didn't excuse her actions. But he pleaded with the judge from a place of deep conflict. He asked for mercy, for leniency, for some measure of compassion for the woman who had given him life, and, despite everything, remained his mother. But mercy did not come. The judge, unmoved by emotion and undeterred by pleas, delivered the sentence. Rosalind Pilmer, life in prison. Evan Wald, life in prison. Both with the possibility of parole, but not for 25 years. And with that, the case that had haunted New York City for over 2 decades was finally closed. Justice, long delayed, had been served. But for the Pilmer family, fractured, grieving, and forever changed, closure came at a heavy, bitter cost.